Have you, this is a fascinating subject, and it's a very, very big subject, and we haven't really got time to explore it, but one thought occurs to me. Have you thought about the situation of Russia, which I think, are they the largest producer now? Or
Very
the
close.
second largest? They're very, very close, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
They're now in a position where they could do what they did to the Ukraine. They start saying, well, you know, we need a bit more of our own oil, etc., and we're only going to supply. We may suspect they're trying to drive the price up. We may suspect they're trying to drive the dollar out of the international settlement system. I don't know. But when I look at what's happening with Russia and at the same time China on the demand side for everything in terms of energy for manufacturing, doesn't this give you a sort of feeling that things are getting really quite dangerous underneath, but in a way that's not really being brought out by any of the media?
Absolutely. So let's imagine that we're somebody with a big decision to make. We're a pension fund. We're an endowment. We are thinking about a new capital. We're going to build a new plant that's supposed to last 40 years. Anybody with a time horizon that goes past the next quarter has to be looking at this issue and looking at it very seriously. Because if we entertain this as a serious thesis, and by the way, somebody could look at it and look at the data and come to a different conclusion, I don't care. But I do care if they dismiss it out of hand, and if you're a pension fund manager and you've got this fiduciary responsibility, you should at least look at it and say, I've dismissed it and here's why. Because if you aren't doing that, you're running the risk that when we take oil and we run it from 100 a barrel to 200 to 300 a barrel, which are not unthinkable in this scenario, you all of a sudden put a bullet in global growth. So now what happens to your generalized portfolio of diversified assets in your index funds? What is the proper price for an index of stocks if we take the growth parameter and we ratchet it down to 0? And we think it's going to be 0 for the next decade. Well, it has a very different price associated with it. You're probably going to, almost every pension fund I've looked at either holds a 7, a 7.5, 8, or 8.5% return. That's the bulk of them.
That's the underlying assumption, isn't it?
Has to be there.
And they haven't been anywhere near that.
Of course not.
For,
of course
for
not.
Years.
With bonds, you know, with so-called safe bonds yielding 0%, there's really no. You're going to have to get extraordinary returns.
And equities really peaked on an inflation-adjusted basis anyway.
Even on a nominal
in 2000.
basis. 13 years.
Yes.
13 years with 0% nominal returns. You know, ex-dividends for stocks.
And the pension fund actuaries are still saying, well, you know, the long-run return is 7.5%.
They're clinging to that, right?
Amazing, isn't it?
Right, and the big risk to that story is this oil story, which says, just give me the thesis that says, here's how we grow without oil growth being there, because they've been so coincident with each other for so long. That's something in the data series I can take back to, you know, the early start of this last century. Here's the oil consumption for a nation. Here's how much its economy actually grew in real terms. We can put those two pieces together and find a very nice match.
Right.
So there's just an extraordinary risk here. And so we hold all of that constant, and what are the world central banks doing in this low real growth environment? They're just throwing money in, just
Absolutely.
throwing more and more money in. And that's a recipe.
Can we touch on the third E, the environment? How does that come into your crash picture?
Well, I'm really here looking at resources for the most part. There's some unknowable cost with shifting weather, and we don't know, you know, that's completely unpredictable.
There's bad science there, I feel.
Yeah, it's going to be tricky too, because is your area going to become more temperate or less, or drier or wetter or colder? We don't really actually know. That's completely chaotic. We can just say maybe things won't be quite the same as they have been, and there's some evidence to suggest weather's getting a little weird. But leaving that aside, I'm really looking at just key resources we can get hard data on. These are things like very unsexy stuff, tin and molybdenum and copper, silver. And when we look at those, we have a story here that says that in just 150 years of industrialization, we have managed to take almost all of the high-grade ore deposits in the world and go through them. And now we're working on lesser and lesser ore-grade deposits. So in the story of copper, the first copper we were mining, these were ore grades that were incredible, 10, 12, 15%. And now we're mining stuff that regularly grades in at 0.2, 0.1%. And the question then becomes, well, what do we do for the next 150 years? But even that obscures it. So here's an interesting fact I love. We've been producing oil commercially since 1859. And so you think, oh, well, we've got 150 years of oil production under our belt. The key fact is this: half of all the oil that's ever been burned has been burned during the lifespan of a 22-year-old.
Really, that's amazing.
Because we've been using 2 or 3% more
increasing
every year.
incrementally,
yes. Exponentially even.
Yes.
So we've been using more and more and more, and that's the whole system. Just slightly more and more and more. It's not scary amounts. We don't need 100% more next year. We need 1.5%, 2% more. It sounds so sedate, but it's not when you really are. You're just building on last year's overall burn rate. So the question then becomes, well, what do we do for the next 22 years if we've burned half of all the oil burned in just the prior 22 years. Well, it's going to be some larger number if we want everything to operate the same. So when I look at mining under these circumstances, I say, listen, to prosecute a 0.1% copper mine means you're going to dig an extraordinary amount of material out of the ground in order to get your 1 pound of copper. In this example, 1,000 pounds. So forget if that makes economic sense. Copper's at $3.50 a pound. I can get this out at $3.20. I win, right? Think about the energy cost embodied in that.
There's huge energy cost, isn't there? Yes.
Absolutely huge. And so my prediction would be that as energy costs start to rise, we'll start to make other rational decisions or even economic decisions that appear rational, which say, we're not digging that big hole in the ground to get that copper out anymore. We're going to have to find some other way of either making do without that copper or recycling more aggressively or using some other substitute of which we don't have any for certain applications for copper. We're going to have to shift. And so that's really what my overall story here is, that there's so many warning signs. It doesn't matter which E we want to peer into, that say there's a very big structural shift coming to how we do business. And so if that's my one summary, is business as usual is over.
Forget it, yes.